Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants Hangout. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I will be your host for today. Really excited for this month. We're celebrating women in science, exploration, adventure, and conservation. We've already started off with 4 or 5 great hangouts this week, and we still have a few more to go today, tomorrow, and through Friday. So really excited today to be joined by Emily Penn. Emily is an oceans advocate, a skipper, and an artist. She splits her time now between running eXXpedition, a series of all-female voyages focusing on relationships between plastics, toxins, and female health. And she's also working on solving ocean plastics issues with Parley for Oceans. She organized the largest ever community-led waste cleanup on the Tongan, tiny Tongan island, and she also rounded the planet on the biofuelled boat Earthrace. So Emily, absolutely great to have you joining us today. Really excited to share some of your stories and work with students.
Great, thanks a lot. So I'm going to open up first I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully you can see that. And then launch my presentation. Has that all worked for you?
We got it.
Great. So welcome everyone. I'm actually speaking to you today from a very sunny London, but that's not usually where I spend my time. I've spent most of the last 10 years actually out at sea, sailing around the world, working on this issue of plastic. So I'm going to share a little bit of that story with you today. And for me, it basically all began when I had a job as an architect lined up in Australia. And I wanted to get there from where I grew up in England without taking an aeroplane. Now, any of you who've got good geography will know that England and Australia are on opposite sides of the planet. And so when I was looking for ways to hitchhike on a boat instead of a plane, I came across this crazy space rocket-like boat called Earthrace. And this boat holds the round-the-world speed record, just 60 days. But it did it running on 100% biodiesel. So fuel that has come from all renewable sources, like being grown or a waste animal fat. Anyway, so I managed to get a job on board this boat, and off we went around the world. But along the way, there were many surprises, things that I had never been expecting to see. And so one night we were woken by the sound of something on the hull of the boat. And when we came up on deck, we found that there were pieces of plastic in the seas around us. And at the time, we were 1,000 miles from the nearest land. And actually, the closest people to us were in the space station in orbit above our heads. And yet there was all this plastic and waste in the ocean. We would then stop at some of these tiny islands in the middle of the Pacific, and we'd find that the locals were struggling to catch fish because commercial fishing had taken all of the fish out of their waters. And they were struggling to grow food because sea level rise had caused their soil to become too salty for their crops to grow. And so suddenly these little island communities without any local food were having to import food from other countries. And it all comes wrapped in this material, this plastic. And so all these beaches that I was landing on, all I was seeing then was plastic on the beaches as well. And so this became something I decided to tackle. And instead of going to work as an architect in Australia, I decided to embark on a career to try and help combat this plastic pollution problem in our oceans. And so the first stop on my journey was this little island in Tonga in the South Pacific. And it looks like absolute paradise from here. There's turquoise ocean, white sandy beaches, and palm trees. But when you actually get down on the ground, it's really a different story. And so these local people have nowhere to put their waste. There's no one who comes to their house every Tuesday morning to collect their rubbish, their trash. It just ends up having to go on the beach or into the ocean. And then a lot of it ends up getting burnt. And if you've ever accidentally thrown a piece of plastic into a fire, you'll know what I mean by that smell of burning plastic. A very distinctive smell, and it was everywhere on these little islands. And when I started to learn about what that chemical was that was coming out in that smoke, I learned about these chemicals that are really harmful to our bodies. They can lead to lots of disease and problems. And we really wanted to try and stop this issue of burning plastic on these little islands. And so that became my first mission. And working together with the local community, we started to put together a project to solve it. And so I ended up teaching in the schools for 6 months, and then we culminated in an enormous big cleanup event. And we actually had 3,000 people, which was 3/4 of the whole population. And together we picked up 56 tons of rubbish in just 5 hours. So all of this trash, we piled it into a great big shed. I mean, the classroom that you're sat in right now, we probably picked up enough trash to fill 3 or 4 of your classrooms right to the top. And it then took us a couple of weeks to clean and sort and package all of that waste into these 3,000 rubbish sacks so that it could get taken away on a container ship. Some went to be recycled, and the rest went to a safe landfill site. So I learned a lot on this time in Tonga, and I was looking at the domestic waste, but I was also interested in the plastic that was washing up on the beaches every morning, and that plastic that I'd seen right out in the middle of the ocean. So I started to learn more about this ocean plastic and met this man here, Captain Charles Moore, who first discovered floating plastic in the Pacific Ocean between Hawaii and California about 25 years ago. But at this point, I still didn't understand why there was all this plastic in our ocean in the first place and how it was actually getting there. So I started to learn more about the way that we use plastic. So this image here shows 60,000 plastic bags. Just give you a little zoom in there so you can see a bit closer. So all of those 60,000 plastic bags. Now, this is how many bags that we use around the world every 3 seconds. And those plastic bags, we use them once, maybe twice, probably 3 times at best. And then we throw them away. And that's the thing about plastic. It's a material that's designed to last forever, but we use it just once and then throw it away. And so it's that mismatch of material science and the design of our products that puts us in this situation of having huge amounts of waste that no longer has any use or any value. So then I thought, can't we just recycle that waste? Can't we just turn it back into new things? But it turns out that only 9% of the plastic that we use gets recycled. So every time we put some plastic in our recycling bin, we think that it's going to get turned into something else. But when it arrives at a recycling centre like this, first it needs to be sorted, because when really plastic is a term that we give to hundreds of different materials. So they all have different properties. Some plastics are hard, some are stretchy, some are coloured, some might be blue or clear. And to give them all those different properties, they need to have a different chemical structure And along the top there, here are some of those different types of plastic. But to recycle something, you can only take one type of plastic at a time. So this huge pile here needs to be cleaned and sorted. And then you come across something like a toothbrush. So tonight when you're brushing your teeth, have a look at your toothbrush and see how many types of plastic are in it. Mine has got 3 or 4 types. The bristles, the grip, and the stem are all made out of something different, making it completely impossible to recycle that toothbrush. So we end up with having loads of waste plastic with not really anywhere for it to go. And so a lot of it ends up finding its way down drains and streams and rivers. And ultimately, everything runs downhill to the ocean. So here we see Los Angeles, a city that does have a good waste management system, but also then somewhere like Indonesia, where the only option is to put your waste in a canal and let it run straight out to the ocean. So what I've realized is that plastic that I've been seeing out there at sea, most of it's coming from land. It's coming from us, from places like these streams and rivers and our drains around the world. And it's making its way through all these different pathways and eventually ending up into the ocean. So once it gets out there, it then starts to meet these great big ocean currents driven by the Coriolis effect due to the spinning of planet Earth. And this is a study that actually models how plastic moves around in the ocean. So many years ago, some drifter buoys with satellites on them were released from each edge of the Pacific Ocean and tracked over the following 20 years. And here you'll see them start to move. So this is now after 1 year, after 3 years, 10 years, and finally 20 years. You can see now this pattern that they've started to make in the North Pacific Ocean. And that in the end, they all start going round and round in circles in a patch in the very middle. And this is the accumulation zone, where the same thing would happen with plastic, is it all wants to move to this patch in the middle of the ocean. And so there's various models that have mapped what this might look like then globally around the whole world. And you can see here that there are actually 5 of these accumulation zones, these places where all of that plastic, because of those ocean currents, wants to move to. And so these 5 hotspots are what we call the 5 subtropical oceanic gyres. And now at this point, back in 2008, that captain I showed you earlier, Charles Moore, he'd been to that spot in the middle of the North Pacific and found plastic there. But at the time, no one had been to these other 4 hotspots to find out if there was plastic there as well. So for me, this became the next mission, to go and sail to those other 4 hotspots and find out if there was any plastic there as well. And if so, how much? And maybe what could we do about it? So we set off on Sea Dragon, a 72-foot sailing expedition yacht made of steel and designed to race around the world with a fleet of 12 yachts. We then turned her into an expedition yacht and set out every time with a different crew of 14 people from all around the world, with scientists, filmmakers, journalists, artists, educators, to go and find out more about what was happening in the ocean, about the plastic, but also bring those findings back to land and try and do something about it. And so we got out there and we started seeing bits of plastic. We got our nets out and we started pulling those bits of plastic that you can see here on board the boat, and we were finding bottle tops and pen lids and combs and anything that you can think of that you've used made of plastic on land. We found something like that out at sea. But what was surprising is we weren't finding anywhere close to the amount that was being documented leaving land every year. So we needed to take a closer look. Using this Manta Trull, which has a net at the back of it with a really fine mesh, and then these great big wings that allow it to glide along the surface of the ocean alongside Sea Dragon, our boat. And what this Manta Trull does is it takes a sample of anything that's floating right up on the surface of the ocean. And when we bring that trawl back on board and turn that fine mesh inside out, this is what we find inside the net. And you can see there a white bottle top. That gives you an idea of the scale of what you're looking at. And then alongside that bottle top, there are hundreds of tiny little fragments of white and yellow and green and blue plastic. And we actually call these microplastic fragments. And each one is smaller than your little fingernail. And it's the same size as the algae and the zooplankton and all of the tiny little plants and animals that also live on the surface of our ocean as well. And what we've come to realize is that the whole surface of our ocean is covered in these little fragments of plastic, lots of them in the middle of these gyres, those accumulation zones, but still even in the other areas, we find it as well. So over those following 2 years, we crisscrossed our way back and forth around the planet, taking these samples down to the South Pacific. This is what we found. You can also see a toothbrush and a little gorilla toy, but also alongside hundreds of these little white and clear and blue pieces of plastic as well. Up into the North Atlantic, down into the Indian Ocean, the same thing in every gyre. And even in the Arctic, we started to find little pieces of plastic there as well. And we realized that it spread over the whole planet. Once we get the samples on board, we look down the microscope to try and work out what's plastic and what's plankton, the fish food that's floating on the surface of the ocean as well. And in this sample here, it turned out that these two fragments were actually plastic, and they look almost identical to what the fish eat. So then we start finding things like this bottle as well that has got little teeth marks on it that match a triggerfish that lives out in these gyres. And then we start catching fish and find plastic in the stomach of them as well. So at this point, we started asking even more questions. Not only what physical impact this plastic would have on our planet, but what chemical impact might it have on the food chain and our fish, our other marine mammals, our turtles, our whales, our dolphins, but also us, human beings, who are also at the top of that food chain. And so we set up a project to really look at how the different chemicals that are in plastic and in the ocean might affect our health, and particularly female health, because we depend on many hormones when we're pregnant to be able to properly have a new human being growing inside us. So this project was eXXpedition, which we've now led 10 of these voyages, sailing around the world with an all-women's crew, tackling the plastics and the toxic story. And there we are. So this brings us to the question of, what are we going to do to solve the problem? because every expedition that we go on, this was actually us crossing the finish line of one of those voyages, and finally, after a month at sea, reaching land. And what I've realized is the more time I spend out at sea, the more I realize that the solutions actually start right here on land. There's been some amazing projects that have looked at how we could actually clean up our oceans. We could put a boom out across the ocean. This project intends to create a boom 5 times the size of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, that's going to stretch across our seas and try and catch the plastic in its path. But we've been looking at this problem all the way from down in the ocean, where it exists, all the way up to the source of the problem here on land. And we realize that even if we can clean up the ocean, if there's still plastic coming from the source, then we're never going to solve the problem. So better than trying to clean it up at sea, we look at the idea of beach cleanups. Hopefully you all at some point had the opportunity to do a beach or a river cleanup somewhere near where you live. And you may have been surprised by the amount of plastic that you found along that shoreline. And of course, if we can catch that plastic, if we can put it somewhere safer, then it's not going to be at risk of finding its way into one of these gyres and into the stomach of a fish or a seabird. We can also try and trap that plastic before it gets out from land. In Baltimore, there is a great big wheel that stops plastic going down the river before it gets into the ocean. And then there's also ways that we can put guards on our drains throughout our cities and next to our homes to stop plastic bottles and things falling down the drain. We can then look at actually the type of products that we use. Here are some examples of biodegradable products. So earlier I talked about how much plastic is in your toothbrush. Well, this one is made from bamboo, so you wouldn't be using any plastic at all. And then this cup here is actually made from corn. And so the same microbes that like to eat corn also like to eat that cup. There's also ways that we can just reduce the amount of plastic we use completely, using reusable cutlery, reusable straws, bottles, bags. And if we're not using that plastic in the first place, then we don't need to worry about what happens to it when we're finished. But we also need to talk about this problem. We need to share it with our friends, our parents, our peers at school. And we need to let other people know about some of these big challenges when we use plastic. And we need to inspire people to shift their behavior and to try and use less plastic at the source. And finally, we can look to what rules we can change. So for you in school, that might be quite easy. You could go to your principal or your head teacher and you could talk to them about banning plastic at school. And then here on a government level, we can ask our policy leaders, our prime ministers, our presidents, to actually change the rules and for example, put a tax or a ban on plastic bags or these little micro beads that often are inside our products that we use to wash with. And so there's just some examples of some ways that we can change the rules, and then we can actually see, it will eventually be able to see a positive impact in our ocean. So I'm going to finish there. I've had my 20 minutes is up, but I would love to answer some questions that any of you have.
All right, Emily, thanks so much. That was great. I love that you shared some of your story as well as what you've seen and solutions, because I think that's very important as well. And then, Emily, you've, I believe, taken the Sea Dragon right into the Great Lakes, and many of our classrooms are located near the Great Lakes. And what have you found there in the Great Lakes?
absolutely. I wonder if, can I just pop my video back on?
Yep.
You got me back?
We gotcha.
Great. Perfect. Yeah, so Sea Dragon did go and sail through the Great Lakes a few years ago and found a lot of plastic there as well. In fact, some of the most dense samples that have ever been collected came out of Lake Ontario. And I think it's partly because there's lots of population that live around the lake. And as we know, the plastic comes from us. And so it congregates there before making its way to the ocean. But you're exactly right. That's one of the interesting things. Wherever you live on planet Earth, whether it is on the banks of the Great Lakes or maybe on a river that eventually runs into the Great Lakes, it is all connected to the ocean. And that's where much of this plastic in the gyres first makes its way on its journey to the sea.
Okay. So just a shout out to the classrooms watching on YouTube. There's a YouTube chat sidebar. Please feel free to let us know where you're watching from and put up a question or two, and we'll get to them during the Q&A. But for now, let's start meeting some of the classrooms who are joining us on camera. So first, we're going to go to, let's see, there we go. Mr. Tyndale's class, grade 4-5. They're joining us in Blackstock, Ontario. Let me turn your microphone on. How are you doing this morning, 4-5s?
We're good. How are you?
Good. You guys have a question for Emily?
I have 3, but I don't want to hog the microphone. I'll let the kids ask. Does anyone have any questions? Chloe, do you have one? Sure, go ahead. Nice and loud. Ken, or you can just scream it out. Go ahead.
Okay. Where did you find the most plastic?
So most of the plastic in the ocean we found in the very middle of these accumulation zones, the gyres, and the most dense was in the North Pacific Ocean. And we're actually heading back there in June this year to have another look and see if it's the same or hopefully a little less plastic or maybe has got some more. So we'll keep you posted on how that goes.
All right. And Mr. Tyndale's class, I know you guys have to duck out a little early today. So if you have another question, feel free to send a student up.
Hunter, you want to try?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Why don't you scream it? We have recess. They're going to go till 9. But go ahead, Hunter. Nice and loud.
What was your favorite place to go so far?
Good question.
So thank you. Good question. My favorite place to visit has definitely been the South Pacific Islands. So I showed you in my presentation an island in Tonga. And although I showed you all of the trash, there's also some really beautiful parts as well. And it's got amazing marine life. It's actually a breeding ground for humpback whales. So the mothers come and they have their calves there. And so we would be swimming and we would actually have these mothers and their little whale calves come up to us when we're snorkeling, come and say hello. And that was, I think, the most magical place that I've been on planet Earth.
Amazing. All right. Well, Blackstock, Ontario, thanks so much for the questions, grade 4-5s. Let's go and visit another classroom. This time we're going to go a little further out. We're going to go and visit Mrs. Hudson's class. They're a grade 4 class in St. John's, Newfoundland. So they're in Canada as well. And I can see that you popped in twice with the camera. Let me see if I have the right mic on. How we doing, everyone? Oh, not yet. Ms. Hudson, do you mind unmuting for me? I can't seem to do it on my end. I see them waving like crazy.
Yeah. How's that?
Gotcha.
Hear you.
What was that?
All right, who has a question?
Jacob? Just say it right here.
What is the most common type of plastic found in the ocean?
Wow, that sounded kind of spacey, but I think I got the question. So what's the most common type of plastic found in the ocean? It's a really hard question to answer because by the time a lot of the plastic gets out into these gyres, it's broken into those little fragments, and it's actually caused by the sun. The heat of the sun and the UV rays break it into little fragments. And so it's really hard to tell what it was when it began. But we definitely find a lot of fishing waste and things like polystyrene or styrofoam and kind of packaging materials. But one thing is for sure, you don't find something like a plastic television or some kind of valuable item. You generally find all of that waste like coffee cups, plastic bags, disposable cutlery. It's all the things that people have used once and then thrown away that ends up as those little fragments.
All right, let me turn your microphone up again. And if you have another question, go ahead.
Who's got?
There's a little space.
Michael.
How long have you been studying plastic?
So it's actually been 10 years since I first got on board that crazy rocket ship and started seeing the plastic. It's something that I thought I might do for a year or two, but every year that's gone by, there's been something else to discover, something else to explore, and now more recently trying to solve the problem. So it's amazing how quickly 10 years can go by.
All right, before we jump to our next classroom, I just want to give a shout out to 2 classrooms who couldn't join us today because of snow days, and hopefully they'll be able to catch it tomorrow. So the first class is Mrs. Krenicki's class, grade 6s in Colchester in the US. And then the other classroom is Mrs. Roche's class in Penn in the US as well. So they're grade 8. So shout out to you guys who will be watching tomorrow. Now we're going to jump over to another class. We're going to go to Mrs. Campbell's class. They're joining us in Thunder Bay. And they are a grade 5 classroom. How's everyone doing this morning? All right, go ahead. Does somebody have a question?
How can kids help with the plastic issue?
Great question. How can you help? So I think the easiest thing is to, through your day at school, every time you come into contact with something that's plastic, ask yourself that question: do I need this plastic in my life? And if it's only going to be there for 10 minutes or half an hour, like a bottle of water or plastic cutlery, like I just saw some forks somewhere, then think, do you really need that plastic? And if you can get by another day without it, then do it. Then stop using it. So that's the first thing you can do. But then also you could think about maybe what you can do as a class, because we all know that when you combine forces and form a little army, you can achieve much more than you can on your own. So maybe there's something you can do as a class to impact the whole school in the amount of plastic that you use. And you could go around your school and look at the places that there's plastic. I don't know, maybe you have plastic cups in school, or you might have straws in the cafeteria. And perhaps you can talk to your other classes and your teachers about eliminating those as well.
All right, and Emily, I remember a few years ago now, we had a Skype with you with my classroom, grade 6s. And what we did is for a week of just eating regularly, we kept all our plastic in one box, and we saw how full it was by the end of that week. And then after that, we tried to get it down to when we could consistently have that box empty and no plastic coming into school and then having to be thrown out. So that's something that we tried. And then we're going to go back to Mrs. Campbell's class, see if they have another question. And I'm wondering, is it crazy hair day there today?
Yes.
Okay, so that explains the plastic forks in the hair. The other, the other hairstyles. Perfect. Well, do you guys have another question for Emily?
Yeah. What was the main thing that motivated you to start cleaning up the beach is in the water?
I think my main motivation was firstly seeing the problem firsthand. You know, when you're immersed in something and you just can't see anything else, it gives you a lot of reason to do something. But then I also think I could see a solution and I could see an impact that I could make. I thought, oh yeah, you know, there's a project, we could actually clean up this island, and all it's going to take is talking to a few people who'll talk to a few more people, and a bit of energy and coordination and logistics, which is something that I was able to do. And we could do it. So I think it was all about taking small steps that motivated me as well. Once you can see the first goal and then you can achieve it, then suddenly the next one becomes clearer and you can go from there.
All right, great question and a great answer. We're going to go to New Jersey now. We're going to go to Mr. Bickle has a group with him in Livingston. They're grade 4 classroom. Let me turn your mic on. There we go. Hey, grade 4s, how are you?
Say hi.
You guys didn't have a lot of snow today?
No.
Well, that's good. I'm glad we could have you today.
All right, who wants to ask their question?
Emily, what is your plan for the future of your organization?
Great question. What's the plan for the future? It's a good question. You always need to keep asking. So our next steps, I mentioned we're going to be going to the North Pacific this summer. So we've got a big expedition lined up to sail from Hawaii to Vancouver, and then around the coastline of British Columbia to Seattle. So that's going to take us a couple of months with 2 teams of 14 women, and we'll be documenting the plastic there. But we're also figuring out how, as a group, we can take things to the next step, because a lot of my work's also shifted to solutions, working with companies. In fact, if you just bear with me 1 second, I'm going to show you something. This was a prop I hadn't planned, but can you see this here? What does it look like?
Shoe.
Just a regular shoe. So this is a really special shoe. It's made by Adidas, but it is made from ocean plastic. So this started out as 11 bottles floating around in the Indian Ocean that ended up on a beach in the Maldives, and then got turned into a yarn that then got knitted into this shoe. And Adidas have now sold over 1 million pairs of these shoes. So that's one example of a solution that I'm now helping brands work on, so that we can kind of make those changes. So in terms of what's next, hopefully lots more projects like those.
That's awesome. And they look good too. So that's another plus. All right. Another question from New Jersey.
What influenced you to become an ocean advocate?
Can you say that again?
Come on up. Come a little closer.
What influenced you to become an ocean advocate?
What influenced me?
Yes.
Was that it? Yeah.
That's it.
Okay, great. So what influenced me to become an ocean advocate? So when I grew up, I spent loads of time in the ocean. I used to sail tiny little 1-person sailing boats. I used to go snorkeling and swimming. You basically couldn't keep me out of the sea. And so I'm sure that played a big role in really how much I love the ocean, and therefore wanted to do some work that allowed me to care for and protect that ocean. And I'm sure we all have those passions, the sport that we love or a place that we like to go to outdoors. And when we end up spending all that time there, we realize how important that type of environment is for us, and go to great lengths to advocate for it.
All right, and let's visit our final live classroom. Let's see, there we go. So there are grade 12 students joining us from Windsor, Ontario, up here in Canada with Mr. Chidaro. Let me turn on your mic.
Go.
All right, grade 12s, you're good to go.
No?
Yep.
Good. So what sort of action is the United Nations or other levels of government, like federally, provincially, how are they taking action when they find or when they discover your findings?
Yeah, great question. So what kind of action are government and people like the United Nations taking? So it's actually quite an exciting time at the moment, because suddenly there is a lot of awareness and action happening. The United Nations Environment Programme have actually just launched a campaign called UN Clean Seas that you can take a look at, and they are convening meetings and actually trying to work out what the goals need to be that they need to start working towards. And at the same time, that spurred a lot of action with governments, definitely over here in the UK and Europe. Lots of agendas have been set for the next 10 or 20 years as to what kind of goals. So for example, trying to get packaging to be 100% recyclable is one that we're seeing a lot at the moment. And that comes off the back of, over in the States for sure, there's been some successful bans of bags and also microbeads, those tiny little pieces of plastic that are in a lot of our pharmaceuticals. And so that sort of helps spur on a lot of that government action as well. So there's things happening. In my opinion, it could be happening quicker and it could be more ambitious. But that's why we do need new ambitious leaders, hopefully like yourselves, who will be moving into those sorts of positions, whether it's working in business or in local government or teaching or other fields, to actually bring in the kind of rules that we want to see going forward.
All right, great question. And let's see if we can get one more. It looks like you guys might be changing classes soon, but let me turn your mic back on.
Yeah, they're changing class, Joe. Thanks a lot, Emily.
Thank you.
Super.
All right. So Emily, I've got a question coming in online. Actually, a couple students have sent things in online. So one is from Ms. Kay's class, who was supposed to join us today, but they're having their snow day. And then one's from a fourth year student, or grade 4 in New Jersey. They're having a snow day as well. So the first one is the plastic in the ocean. Is it changing animal behavior at all? Like maybe are they using it for camouflage or?
Yeah, so one type of animal behavior that has been recorded is when you have this plastic that's floating across an ocean, it starts to act a little bit the same way as a coral reef does. And with a coral reef, you get all of the little organisms that grow on it, and then you get the little fish and then the slightly bigger fish, and you end up having an ecosystem that is able to survive and function. That's why coral reefs are so important for the health of our ocean. But if you can imagine then, if a whole load of net and plastic takes on that role, gets little organisms growing all over it, then the little fish, then the slightly bigger fish, and it forms an ecosystem, but it's detached, and then it starts moving across an ocean, we start to have something called invasive species. And it means that fish and other organisms end up living on the wrong side of the world than where they're supposed to live. And so that really starts to shift the dynamics and the behavior of those animals.
Probably easier if I turn my microphone on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Emily, I can't thank you enough. It's been great to spend some time with you today. I know the classrooms really enjoyed it, and we're looking forward to it. And the work that you're doing is so important, and getting out and reaching students like this is important as well. So thank you for what you do, and thank you for being so generous with your time to hanging out with our classrooms today.
No problem at all. Thanks for all your great questions. Yeah, and hopefully you get the chance to do something for the oceans today as well.
All right, well, let me turn the microphones on so the classrooms can say goodbye and thank you, then we'll sign out for today. So boys and girls, nice and loud, goodbye and thank you. All right, well, once again, thanks for hanging out with us today. And like Emily said, it can be as easy as telling people what you've learned today, and that can be a big first step. So again, thanks for hanging out with us. We've got more hangouts today and many more throughout the week, so I hope to see your classrooms again. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.